Hey, welcome to Channel 17. It's live at 5:25. Thanks for tuning in. And I'm joined today with Ted Wimpey, who is the director of the Fair Housing Project at CVOE. And in another life, I used to work with Ted at Chittenden Community Action. And you want to tell us a little bit about CVOE and the Fair Housing Project itself?
I'll tell you a little bit about the agency as a whole, Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunity. As the name implies, it primarily covers 4 counties, Chittenden, Grand Isle, Franklin, and Addison counties. However, the 3 programs in what we call Coordinated Statewide Housing Services, which includes the Fair Housing Project, are actually statewide in outreach. The agency as a whole provides a whole array of services, including weatherization, Head Start, food stamp outreach, just a lot of different services. Yeah, Vermont, and under the Coordinated Statewide Housing Services that the Fair Housing Project is a part of is Vermont Tenants, which provides advice, information, referral services to tenants statewide. The Mobile Home Project, which works with residents of mobile home parks, primarily with parks. That's also statewide. And then the Fair Housing Project, that's statewide. And the Fair Housing Project has been, for some years, doing education and outreach and trainings about fair housing rights and responsibilities. And one of those kinds of trainings we've been doing involves something called Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing. I'll get into a little more here.
So the brunt of that program is based on fair housing. And, do you want to talk a little bit about what the criteria is? There's, in talking with you before, there's state fair housing law and there's also federal fair housing law. Huh?
Yes, the first fair housing laws in the country that I'm aware of anyway, was federal law that was a part of the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Before that, what most of us now consider to be obviously illegal, saying no blacks allowed, no Jews allowed, things like that, were not illegal. And then in 1968, the first federal fair housing law was passed, as I say, as it was Title VIII, a part of the Civil Rights Act of 1968. It really only got finally passed and signed after the assassination of Martin Luther King and a lot of urban uprising. People were just fed up with the situation.
It seems amazing that as recent as 45 years ago or something, there was an ability in this country to deny people housing based on their race or religion.
It is. It's unbelievable, and we've come a long way. We've got a ways to go. In 1988, before that, Vermont started passing some fair housing laws. I'll get into that in a minute, but the federal government passed laws, amendments that added to protections under federal law in 1988, and that added family status, meaning protection for people with minor children under the age of 18 and people with disabilities.
So can you go through what those fair housing criteria, the categories are?
I'll go through first the federal fair housing protected categories, and then what Vermont adds on in addition. Vermont law provides protections for all the categories that the federal law does, plus some extra classes. So under federal law, there's a protection for race, color, national origin, religion, sex, as I said earlier, family status, meaning people with minor children, and disability. In Vermont law, there's also protections for age, marital status, meaning single or married, sexual orientation, receipt of public assistance, which would include things like Section 8, in fact, which has the most direct impact on housing, but it could include other kinds of public assistance. And gender identity, and finally, something that was added most recently last year, and it's harder to say, but to explain it, it means that municipalities, primarily we're talking about here, cannot discriminate against developments that would include low-income people. So there cannot be denial of permits based on the fact that it's expected that low-income people will be provided housing. So those are all, they could put those together, and those are all the protections in the state of Vermont. And the first ones I read were federal protections.
So, you know, I mean, everyone regards, I think, Vermont as kind of this progressive, forward-thinking, liberal state. Are these kind of categories ones that are really necessary, or what's the status of fair housing in Vermont?
Well, in terms of testing that has been done, and CVOE, Fair Housing Project, has done some testing in the past. There's still being testing done under some other federal grant by Vermont Legal Aid. Well, testing is where, for instance, you would train testers, and they would go, you know, seeking housing either to rent or to buy, depending on the kind of tests you're doing. They would have similar profiles in terms of income, and so they would be acting. This has all been approved by the courts. It's perfectly legal. But one group would be not in a protected class, depending on what you're testing for, let's say race, for instance. And then there might be a tester then who's African American, who has the same, you know, is given the same income profile, and it's looked at over, you know, if they're doing a broad testing, kind of survey testing, looking at if the people of color are treated differently than the people who are white. And in the testing, there is indication of some level of discrimination in the state, but there are other kinds of discrimination that kind of come to the forefront in terms of what Human Rights Commission and Vermont Legal Aid deals with, and that has to do especially with disability issues, some of which can get a little bit complicated, some of which are not so complicated, and receipt of public assistance, family status, you know, people who don't want to rent with people with children, for instance. So but there are some of all these categories that will come up from time to time in Vermont. Obviously, Vermont is a very white state, so there aren't that many African Americans, for instance, except to a growing extent in Chittenden County and Burlington, Winooski, and so forth, looking for housing. But one of the things that we're concerned about is municipal policies, zoning and permitting and so forth, that tend to have an exclusionary impact. In other words, because they increase the cost of housing, for instance, that people in some of these protected classes who tend in many cases to be of lower income are not given as much housing opportunity because they can't afford to live in those towns, maybe because of the lot size requirements or other kinds of requirements built into the zoning regulations in those towns.
So the idea is to try and have each community provide for a range of housing opportunities. Is that it?
Well, that's the ideal, and one of the things that we're really focusing on in partnership with entities such as the State Department of Housing and Community Development are to work on something called Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, which is obviously a mouthful. So AFFH is often used, the acronym, because HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, when it provides money, which in the state of Vermont there's two receiving entities, the City of Burlington and the State of Vermont. The City of Burlington uses it in various ways, and the City of Burlington for development, community development, block grant money we're talking about in particular. The State of Vermont, its money flows out through various municipalities, but when those municipalities receive that federal money, they're required to affirmatively further fair housing, meaning they're supposed to not only abide by fair housing laws, but they're supposed to actually take proactive steps to try and expand fair housing choice to people.
So recently, I mean, just this week, we heard of the state CDBG money being given to Waterbury and to Waitsfield, I think, to redevelop their municipal buildings that were wiped out during Irene. So really, they're also signing on to provide this
affirmatively furthering fair housing.
That's right.
Right. That's right.
That's
true, and there are at any one time, I don't know how many municipalities are receiving the money, although municipalities that want to possibly apply for it in the future are using any money they might have gotten in the past, would want to take the steps that they need to take to show that they're affirmatively furthering fair housing. Now, HUD has actually, over the past few years, started more actively enforcing that rule that they have. Some years back, it was kind of more of a wink and nod, you know, somebody gets CDBG money and they check a box saying, yes, we're affirmatively furthering fair housing, and okay, good. Now it's more like there needs to be a proof that, you know, that there are certain steps being taken to really do that.
So through like their zoning regulations and comprehensive plan and municipal plans?
Well, the state has to come up with its own ways of looking at the sub-recipients. In other words, in the state of Vermont, as I say, all the state community development block grant money flows through municipalities, so the state has to have its own ways of assessing whether the towns they give it to are affirmatively furthering fair housing, and then the state in turn is audited by HUD to make sure that it's taking the steps that it needs to take in order to show that the state as a whole is doing that.
So does the state have the proper process and verifications in place, do you think?
Well, I think that it's a work in progress, and you know, it's one of the projects that we've been in partnership with the State Department. The Department of, it's changed names a few times. It's now called the Department of Housing and Community Development, which I think is a good name for it. Up until just recently, had been renamed to the Department of Economic Housing and Community Affairs. You know, after something changes enough times, you sort of lose track of it. But at any rate, we've worked in partnership with them and hope to continue to do so, to try and do, come up. And Vermont Legal Aid has done some of this work too in terms of coming up with instruments for assessing whether municipalities are, in terms of their plans and other things like the permitting process, zoning, if they are affirmatively furthering fair housing, or to what extent, whether they are required, whether they're recipients of this money or not. And so, everybody needs to be in compliance with fair housing law, whether they receive the money or not. It's just that if they receive the federal money, they need to go one step beyond. So I think the state has been working on it, and hopefully will continue working on it, and we hope to be a partner with them in doing that.
Yeah, I just want to take this opportunity to remind viewers, this is a great opportunity if you're watching today, Thursday, the 16th of May, to call in if you have a question about fair housing issues. Ted has been working in that area for a long time, and I'm sure would welcome the opportunity. How many complaints or notices do you get at the Fair Housing Project of issues relative to both federal and state categories?
Yeah. Well, because we're not an enforcement entity, we have, even though in the past we have run a hotline where people did call in and leave complaints, and we would get back in touch with them. And very roughly, this is a very rough estimate, say 50 complaints a month, maybe. That might be on the high end. But the actual HUD money that funds fair housing, education, outreach, the last round of it we did not get. We had to reduce staff by a person, so it's just me doing it now. We're not formally running that hotline. We do have if people call into it, they get a recording, refers them to Vermont Legal Aid, which is active, and the Human Rights Commission, which is another, these are all partners of ours in fair housing. But between, legal aid and the Human Rights Commission, and even now a few calls will filter in, and I'll try to work on them as best I can. Usually ends up being a referral anyway, because we're not an enforcement entity and do not have attorneys on staff or anything.
So you think, though, 50 a month or something between the three of you?
Oh, between the three of us, it would be more than that.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, it would be more than that.
Do you find that surprising? I personally find that surprising, but
Well, that's all the complaint. That's everybody calling in who thinks they've been discriminated against, and some of those will be eliminated because either it's not a fair housing issue at all, it's really another kind of issue, or it's something that is what they call without merit in legal terms. It might have the appearance of a fair housing issue, but not anything that could actually be pursued legally.
So this affirmatively furthering fair housing.
Yes.
This initiative was started just recently by HUD?
Well, no. It's been a rule of HUD's for many years now. It's just over the past few years. I'm not going to say exactly how many years because the degree varies anyway. But HUD has been taking it much more seriously. To the point that there have been, some fairly high-profile cases around the country where municipal or county entities have been found to be in violation of that rule and are told by HUD, you need to either correct this or give us back your money and maybe be subjected to some penalty as well. Mm-hmm. Because they said, falsely said that they would be affirmatively furthering abide by that rule, and they weren't. So because of that, there's a need for all entities that receive federal monies to make sure that they have in place programs and policies for affirmatively furthering fair housing. So that can be everything from adjusting their town plans so that they are more inclusionary to actually, Burlington is one of the, I think there might be another town by now that in the state that has something called inclusionary zoning, which actually requires a certain number of affordable units be built when there's a development of a certain size. That because there's often a correlation between affordability of housing and the ability of people who are in protected classes to be able to get into that housing, to be able to afford that housing. There's a correlation between making more affordable housing available and being in compliance with fair housing law and taking that extra step of AFFH.
Mm-hmm. Is there, so the fair housing project that you're directing, are you looking to kind of keep this in the public's view for the next 2 years, or is there like did HUD ask you for a contract of, okay,
well,
help us out?
It's interesting you mentioned that. We're writing a new proposal for funding to HUD, and one of the components of the last, what they call NOFA, Notice of Funding Availability, is something under the general category of education and outreach that focuses on affirmatively furthering fair housing. And this is what we're going to be really focusing on in our proposal to HUD. And it'll be done, if we do get funding for it, in partnership with the state, mm-hmm. continuing, works that we've been doing and doing even more of it. Mm-hmm. And with other entities, all the partners we don't know yet. We're sure that if we do that particular component and get funded for it, at least the state will have to be one of our partners. And always really the Human Rights Commission as a partner. Mm-hmm. There may be others. Usually there are a few other partners that play relative roles in it. But we'd like to keep, the whole issue of affirmatively furthering fair housing alive indefinitely, and a kind of a macro level of compliance with fair housing law, even aside from federal monies and where they flow.
No, that makes sense. Is there one category or a couple categories that are typically the ones that are most abused or broken?
In the state of Vermont, the issue of and this is one of them, which is not a federal law, is the receipt of public assistance. Mm-hmm. And disability, which is in federal law as well. And that can include things like service animals, for instance, which mm-hmm. can become mm-hmm. contentious issues. A lot of complaints.
So is the legal right for those who might have a guide dog, and pets are normally not allowed in that unit, the landlord is obliged?
That's true. It's well established that housing providers have to accept service animals for people with disabilities, even if they normally have a no pet policy, because these aren't really pets per se.
And do you find that most municipalities and entities that are not kind of complying with these guidelines are doing so out of ignorance, or do you think that there really is kind of an intention behind it?
Well, it varies a lot. You know, I think that if you're looking at them at a municipal level and you're looking at planning and zoning, some of the exclusionary zoning policies, those policies that tend to exclude people in protected classes, which especially depends a lot on level of incomes. It varies from place to place, but I think in a lot of situations they would like to exclude low-income people.
You have a subconscious act or something?
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons it was important to pass that most recently passed protection that says that if there's a proposed development that where it's recognized and part of the proposal that, you know, low-income people would be living there, may not be all low-income people, but be low-income people, that a municipality cannot say, no, we don't want that development because low-income people are going to be living here.
Hey, we're winding up here, but I just wanted to get your insights. You know, the legislative session just wrapped up this week. Was there any housing issues that made a mark on this legislative session?
Well, one important thing is the level of funding for the Vermont Housing Conservation Board has remained good, you know, despite, you know, the fiscal problems, and that's good in terms of generating more affordable housing around the state all the time. There were some proposed landlord-tenant bills which did not really go far at all and were not bills that we would have supported, really. The only fair housing law is there was a kind of a just a housekeeping change in law that puts the state law in sync with federal law in terms of advertising. And it's too complicated to go into, especially at this point.
Yeah. Another show.
Yes.
Yeah. Hey, well, Ted, I want to thank you very much for coming in and sharing insights and information on the affirmatively
furthering fair housing.
Fair housing. I didn't have my glasses. Affirmatively furthering fair housing. It is a tongue twister.
It is. Yeah.
I think we had a website up for the HUD, a HUD website up for people to go to and get more information to. Can they get some?
We have the quickest way for people to get to our fair housing information is we have a regular CVOE website, which this page will take you to ultimately, but we just got a domain name, vermontfairhousing.org, all just vtfairhousing.org, vtfairhousing, all one word.org. That goes to one simple little page that you click on. There's only one thing you can click on, and it takes you to a page with a lot of information. Then from there, if you want to go into the rest of CVOE's site, you can.
Oh, good. Well, good. Well, we'll make sure to post that on our website for this program.
Excellent.
All right, great.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Ted, and thank you all for watching.